So in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you can either have El Nino or La Nina or neutral conditions. And neutral conditions is kind of a boring word. There's not a fancy name for normal water temperatures. But then Fernando told me that he calls it La Nada. So you could have El Nino, La Nina, or La Nada. And basically that's where we are today. And so what does that mean? If you look here, when this water is close to normal, we say it's neutral or La Nada, just normal water temperatures. Just like the weather can be unusually warm or unusually cold, the ocean does the same thing. It gets unusually warm or unusually cool, but on much longer time horizons. Instead of this taking place, like the weather might change dramatically in one day, the ocean will change dramatically over the course of 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. There's a much longer time scale. But right now, that water is normal. And if it was warm, we call it El Nino. If it was cold, we call it La Nina. But this is important because we can look back in time and try and see other years that had a similar ocean setup to the one that we have today to get an idea of what may be ahead. And we actually measure the water temperatures out there, and what you can see is this. These are the actual water temperatures back at the beginning of the year, and this is where they're projected to be based on a number of computer models. And over the next 3 to 4 months, this is very likely to be the case. And so this here allows us to start thinking about what happened in the past when the ocean followed that type of pattern, because it has. And that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple of reports. Now, you might notice that it extends all the way out into December and even January. But we'll have a lot better idea of what the end of the year looks like once we get into September and October. For now, most of what we conclude is basically over the next 3 to 4 months. We don't want to get super far ahead, but this is our best projection for now based on a number of computer models. And these are the years that we've identified, and you can see how we did this. Here's our projection starting, this is in March, April, here we are now in May, and then we're going forward. And you can see these other years that had a similar trajectory, and those were 1977, 1980, 1990, 2005, and 2014. And these are our best analogs, especially for the United States, and for getting an idea of what's going to happen with their corn and soybeans. And again, this is just stuff that I talk to my customers, and now I'm just telling you about it to get an idea of how we think about it and what this means. And there are some interesting things here. Now, I know in the past, Fernando has said, whoa, you really called, I think it was 2 years ago, there was an event, and last year I think was pretty good too. Sometimes you can take all this information and you can come up with some really great conclusions, and they work. And those are the times where, my customers listen. I'm like, look, here's the data. It suggests this. If we get into this time of the year and we start seeing dry or wet weather, that's it. This situation right now isn't quite as good. It's not as solid of a situation as we have, but there still are some important conclusions that we can make. So these are U.S. corn yields going back to 1960 and then through last year. Oh, and I should mention, I use Google Translate from English to Portuguese, but yeah, okay, so I heard people complain that Google Translate doesn't do that well, but that's all I had. But most of the yields in these years were okay. The only exception really was 1980. We had a pretty big heat wave and drought in the United States in the summer. But generally, the yields were okay. So, at this point in time, just based on this, we don't have any super strong conclusions to make that either really good weather or poor weather is coming up, because, we've kind of been following this trend line. But one thing I want to point out that's just kind of an interesting note that I think is really affecting people in the United States and the way they think about yields right now. And this has happened in the past, and I think it's happening right now, but if you look at the last 12 years of yields in the United States over here, we've had 12 years in a row of normal or good crops. And this has happened before. But it is unusual because you could argue that this extends all the way back to 1996 when things started to stabilize, except for some poor years in 2011 and 2012. The United States is in an incredible period where we have fairly quiet weather. Now, some people argue that it's the technology that we're looking at, that's what's really driving this whole thing. But, this line, and it's very similar for Brazil, it explains about 90% of the variation in yield every year. And the other 10% is primarily due to weather. That's what's making it shift around a little bit with poor weather and good weather. I mean, we had some incredibly wet years from 2014 through 2019, with 2019 being too wet. Then, since then, it's been kind of up and down. We get some dry weather, we get some wet weather, but we haven't had what we're kind of known for, which is a big, major heat wave or drought. It's just been really quiet in the summertime. And so what happens is, people are starting to debate whether or not, we should still be following this line. Are we like going lower now? Or, what's happening? I would pretty strongly argue that you just want to stay right on that line. There's no reason to start thinking that something dramatic has happened with corn. Soybeans might be a different story. But for corn, this is kind of, just an observation. And, when I did my master's degree, the paper I had to write to graduate was whether U.S. corn and soybeans and technology and how they're interrelated. And at the time, back in 2005 and 6 and 7, there were reports coming out from some seed companies that, the U.S. yields were going to be 200, 300 bushels per acre 20 years from now. Now it's almost 20 years from now, but you can see we're still right on that line. And the conclusion was that you couldn't discount weather as part of the reason for seeing good years, because we had a lot of strings of good years there. And we're kind of in the same thing now, I think, too, where, something's going to happen, either up or down, where people see that this line is still valid. But as of today, with 6 years in a row of kind of right on the money yields, people are questioning this. And that's going to play a role, I think, in what happens later this year if the weather is normal. We'll see. If you look at U.S. soybean yields in those 5 years, the story is actually a little better for soybeans. We only had one bad year in 1980, but the others were pretty good, and some of them were really good, especially in 05 and in 14. So this is, there might be some upside risk to the U.S. soybean yield, and you'll see why when we get to looking at some of the rainfall numbers. But that's just looking at, these 5 years. One thing I want to point out, and this is something that always needs to be kept in mind, is that every one of these years here, it's either in an El Nino or a La Nina or a La Nada. It's always, that's your 3 buckets you can use. And so these next couple of charts, I'm going to put them all in their buckets and just show you, what it looks like if you have these different types of U.S. growing seasons. But the middle here, these are all the neutral years that we're in right now. And look at the U.S. yields. They've been all over the place. We have the worst yield on record in 2012 and some of the best on record in many of these other years. You can see that when we have La Nina, the story is kind of the same. But good weather in the U.S. is El Nino. When you have El Nino that's lingering in the summer, that's where we kind of get our bigger crops. So, this chart right here means you've got to be on your toes because things could go really well or they can go really poorly. And I guarantee you that in all these years here, maybe except for some of the big droughts like 2018 and 2012, or 1988 and 2012, you wouldn't be sitting here on May 15th and be like, I know which bucket I'm in. I know what's going to happen. It's just a little early. We're still planting. Whether that really matters is still 4 to 10 weeks out. And so the point here is, that you just kind of need to pay attention for corn. And for soybeans, the story is pretty much the same. It's even more pronounced. We had our very best crop on record with neutral summers and the worst crop on record. And you can see that here. So, again, in most of these years, in the middle of May, you would know which one was about to happen. And as of today, we still don't know, though you saw some of those analogs show that, we're probably not going to be real far high or far low just based on that. But that's the point I want to make, is sometimes you'll see people say, oh, we're in a La Nina, so now it means this. It certainly means that in Argentina. If you have a La Nina in the summer, December, you're probably going to have a yield problem. That can extend into southern Brazil as well. But in the United States, it doesn't work so well. And that's where, it might be used a little bit too much for long-term forecasting in the United States. It's more challenging in Brazil, but it certainly works in Argentina, and it certainly works in Australia. But, I'm just trying to point out that you still don't know everything, even with all this information as of today. We only have really 2, maybe 3 concerns at this moment in time. If you look at the 5 analogs in July in the U.S. Corn Belt, this is the middle where all the corn and soybeans are produced, basically comprised of 7 states surrounding Iowa. 3 of them were pretty dry. And so that just gives us some indication that the potential exists for some dry weather in July. Now, a dry July, if you only had one piece of information to forecast the U.S. corn yield, this is it. You just want to know what happened in July if nobody else would tell you anything. Just, this would correlate the best to everything. Now, it wouldn't correlate great if that's the only thing you have, but, it is a tiny bit concerning seeing some dry Julys on there. But, on the other hand, June didn't really show anything unusual. May didn't show anything unusual. And maybe more important than that, especially for soybeans, is what happened in August. That's going to be the next chart here. August is the most important month for soybeans in the United States. And we had a lot of really wet Augusts for whatever reason with these neutral summers. Look at some of these years here. 1977, 1980, which is interesting because that was some low yield. You had too much rain. So, we think that at some point, starting up in July, late July and into August, more than likely we're going to see a stormy pattern set up. And this